Hi there. So I thought I would make a video to demonstrate what I did when I woke up 3 weeks ago tomorrow, so on 3 weeks ago Sunday, with pretty severe pain in my right sacrum area. I have been having some issues with this right hip occasionally, and something had happened. I had overused it, or I hadn't used it in a certain way. I don't really know what happened, but it flared up. And when it flared up, it went across into my back pelvis. Now, this isn't unusual. When you feel discomfort in a body part, like a shoulder or a hip or your neck or your spine, is that I'll just use the word flare up, when it flares up, or when it feels painful in a way that it doesn't sort of normally just bother you, it feels like sometimes the area has moved. So for me, there has been previously discomfort in my sacrum on the right side. But this hip is kind of the area that's been bothering me. So long story short, I did something to offend this hip joint even more than it normally is offended. And it moved into my sacrum. So when I woke up on Sunday morning, having no idea that I had offended it the day previous, I was in a lot of pain. And in fact, that morning we went to Costco and I had to hold on to the cart. That I really couldn't hold anything in a lever out here away from my body without feeling quite intense discomfort in the sacrum. And that moved over the course of the next couple of weeks. That moved into different places and it changed. And so the first couple hours of feeling that on that Sunday morning was pretty traumatic and pretty catastrophizing for me. I had made a decision that I was going to have to get a hip replacement, that I was never going to be the same. I was never going to be able to lift weights again, never going to be able to backpack. What's going to happen? And that is typically, I think, a place that most of us go when we're feeling pain is, oh my God, now what? Or, oh, I'm getting old, or whatever it is. Now, I know a lot about pain science. And I know a lot about moving my body. And I would say that I'm a fairly embodied person. So I was able to work myself off the cliff emotionally. And I know that my experience is that movement is the anti-inflammatory. Yeah, did I take Tylenol that day? You bet I did. And I took it over the course of the next week when I needed it. And I was careful in my movement. So I didn't go out to the garage and start lifting weights. I mean, holding something out here hurt. I knew it wasn't always going to hurt holding something out here in front of me, like even something that weighed, a couple pounds, but it hurt at that moment. And so bringing myself down from catastrophizing into a place of, all right, this is what's going on for you. It's informational. Let's see what we can do. So for me, movement becomes an anti-inflammatory. It's finding the right prescription. How much of that anti-inflammatory do you need to take? So how much movement do I actually make in my body? So typically, if it's hip, back, pelvis, what I'll do is go to the floor. I'll go to the floor and begin movements that require less muscular work against the force of gravity. So being on the floor, I don't have to do as much to hold myself up. Then I'll move on to all fours. So this is very developmental. And then I'll move usually into some sort of squatting position where I'm starting to come upright. And then I'll move upright. Now, upright was the least comfortable for me for sure. And I began to notice in this movement practice, when I was sucking the breath in and bracing, because that was happening quite a bit. And that's your nervous system. Your nervous system is the best thermometer and alarm system in the world. It says, stop. And so when that would happen, I would notice when it happened and how I could work with that. I was going to use the word manipulate, but how I could work with that to my advantage. So I'll give you some of those clues as I go along. The other thing I did after this movement was, I kept moving. And again, nothing rigorous. I didn't work out with weights that day. I didn't run that day. I didn't ride my bike that day. I didn't go put my backpack on and do a big hike. But I also did a walk that day. I did a long walk, an hour and a half walk. Walking felt really good to that region. Again, noticing my habits. I was doing that, I was literally grasping my breath at times because the pain got intense when I would move first through certain things. So again, basically what I'm saying is pain, unfortunately, is part of being in a human body. How I work with my emotions around pain is very helpful. How I work with my thoughts around pain is very helpful. And knowing that my experience, and I think the experience of many people who treat pain and discomfort, is that movement can be an anti-inflammatory. Movement can help. We just have to find the right thing to do. So what I want to share with you today is what I did on the floor that first day and what I did through that first week. And I'll tell you that within a couple days, I was probably 60 to 70% better. I'll use the word better, less in pain. Within a week, I was probably 85 to 90%. I still wasn't lifting weights. I still haven't lifted heavy weights since that time. So that's almost 3 weeks, unfortunately. And then I would say that about 2 weeks into it, just a little past 2 weeks into it, I started to feel like I'm not feeling any compromised area back here. Hip is still doing hip things, but I'm not feeling the sacral area. It's different for everybody. So I'm not telling you if you do this on the floor that you're going to somehow get better. But if we can ease back into movement, if we can ease back into the reality that being in a human body is sometimes a painful thing, and that if we can do our best to take care of that through some movement, not lose movement, then we might be in a better position to work through that pain. I'm hoping that makes sense. What I really want you not to hear is that if you are in chronic pain somewhere in your body, that I'm telling you that that it's not there. Of course it's there. Pain is pain. Pain is real. And how we each work with our pain is different and varied, right? So, but this was my prescription for what was going on in my body. Okay. Long-winded introduction. So here's how I started, and it was hard to get down to the floor, but I got down to the floor and I laid on the floor and I put one hand on my lower abdomen and one hand on my solar plexus. And one of the things that I noticed was compromised immediately upon waking with pain that morning was my breath. I just taking a deep breath was really hard, particularly when I was weight bearing. So what I'm working on here is breathing without any hitch, breathing without any strong edge or hold. And feeling, and you may be able to see it in the video, feeling that my abdomen had permission to be very big and broad when I inhaled, and softening without any sense of tugging or holding or gripping when I exhaled. The exhale was really important. I found the exhale portion of my breath to be really important in coming back from this pain that I was in just a few weeks ago. Where's their tension? Where am I holding tension that doesn't need to happen? Can I release and let the floor support this right back pelvis? Can I let my right femur just fall into my right hip joint and trust that I don't have to use a lot of muscular action to do that? And then I took the arms out to the side and I began a very slow, with my breath, movement of cat-cow through my pelvis lumbar. So I arched the lumbar a little bit. So I just brought it into a little bit, and this is anterior pelvic tilt of my pelvis. And then I pressed and rolled slightly down towards the ground. So there's this really subtle activity happening now in my pelvis. My hands are moving right now to show you what my pelvis is doing. A little anterior pelvic tilt, a little posterior pelvic tilt. And I went really slowly. And I noticed as I was moving, I noticed if there's any catch in my breath. If I move in a range of motion that creates a signal of pain in my body, the perception that I'm harming myself, can I move right up to that place and not go into it so that I don't harden my response? I inhaled to gently arch, and I exhaled to tuck or flex. So I'm moving some load through my pelvis, through my lumbar spine, and even a little bit at the hip joint, which I think is probably the place where whatever injury or whatever is going on in my body is happening. Right. And then I came back to neutral and I went side to side. So I dropped into one side of my pelvis and then across into the other side of the pelvis. Now, this is very different than windshield wipers. This is a much heavier load and twist. I'm really trying to work a pelvic activity. So it's very small. So I'm just rocking the boat basically of my pelvis across from one side to the other. In terms of kind of kinesthetic terminology or anatomic terminology, this would be frontal plane motion. So I'm just rocking a little bit side to side. So I've continued practicing this floor-based activity a little bit. I did some with my classes just to introduce them to it, and then just on my own, because it's also a really nice little warm-up. And then I brought myself back to neutral, checked in, found my breath again. And then I did what's called sacral clock. So I pulled the back of my top pelvis towards 12, right? So I was in spinal flexion. And then I rolled along the outside of my back pelvis down towards 6, which would be the tailbone, around and up the other side of the clock. So like it's a face of a clock. I'm going all the way around the 9, the 10, the 11, the 12. And I did that really slowly. And again, noticing, because this is really important for pain, at least for me, is noticing the places that I tend to grab, brace, or grip. And see if I can move right up to those places and keep my breathing really stable and steady. So again, I'm going nice and slowly, and you are seeing my legs move a little bit, but I'm really driving this pelvic motion from the pelvis and not from a lot of movement in the legs. Now I got to go in the other direction. So starting at the 12, I'm going to go around the back pelvis and down towards the tailbone. Now, one of the things I notice in myself, and I think I notice it in my students and in others, is our tendency to move quickly through things, like to get them done, like they're a checklist, check, it's done, versus what maybe this is all I do are these sacral rocks. I have 10 minutes and I'm in pain. So maybe this is as far as I go. And I just move super slowly through these sacral movements, through these pelvic movements, right? Through sacral nutation, counter nutation, through sacral rolling, through pelvic movement. All right. So I came back to center, keep checking in with the breath. And then I did a couple isometric activities. Now, isometrics, when you get into a position and you use load, you use force to stay there. And I used my arms to help. So I brought my legs up and I used my hands on the outside of my legs. And I pushed out with my legs and in with my hands. So I'm creating a bracing activity, but I'm breathing through it. Now, leaving my legs up, I crossed my forearms and brought my hands to the insides of my knees. I pushed out and I squeezed in with my legs. Now, I also know from my experience that these isometric pushes, and I did that 3 times, pushing in on my legs and out with my legs, holding for like 10 to 30 seconds and breathing naturally, that sometimes this will actually, I'm going to use some terminology here that I'm not sure is correct. I'm going to cross my forearms and come to my inner knees. It can reset the sensation in my sacroiliac joint. So I'm squeezing in with my legs, pressing out with my arms. I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to press out with my legs, push in with my arms. And then I'm going to push out with my hands, push in with my legs. Okay, now from that isometric, I grabbed my shins, I relaxed my feet, and I did passive, what I would call passive marching. So I'm moving my hip joint into flexion and away from flexion with my arms, kind of like my legs are gear shifts. This is passive. Since my back doesn't hurt you, I'll show you active would be me really using the muscles of my hip flexors to do this. But because I was in pain, I was using my arms and trying to get some range of motion passively. Again, I was moving very slowly and cautiously, but also watching, was I being cautious to the place where I wasn't breathing, where I was tight in my neck, tight in my eyes, where my belly was tight. And then I brought my legs in next to one another and I opened and closed them. Again, I'm using my arms to catch the weight of the leg so that the loads transferred through my sacroiliac joints, through my hip joints, through my pelvis are less, right? If I have to do this with my own legs, it's much more. I'm resisting gravity a lot more. If I'm using my arms to support this activity, it's really different. Now, I was surprised at this next thing. I wanted to get some external and internal rotation, and I wasn't sure how this was going to go. I brought my hands down to my feet in Baddha Konasana, and I did a deep external rotation, which also really flattens, not a word I like to use, but flattens out or lengthens or flexes the lumbar spine and the sacrum. And then I turned my knees out and my feet in, and I pushed in on, so I'm holding here and I pushed in. So I did internal rotation. And then I did external rotation. And honestly, in my own assessment of my body in that right hip joint, something's going on in internal and external rotation for me in that femur coming into the acetabulum, which is your hip joint. And then knees in, feet out, pushing on my outer knees. Mm-hmm. Good. And then I brought my feet down to the ground. And I just noticed. Now, there was a lot of other stuff I could have done, right? I could have done hamstring lengthening, some movement, but I really didn't want to do a lot of long lever stuff out of my pelvis. So I was in a lot of pain in this back right pelvis. So I settled, I noticed. Getting up was hard. So let me give you a clue as to what I figured out. When I had to use a lot of spinal flexion with force, loading my spine in flexion, what I realized was I was going, grasping my breath, pulling it in, which is the body's natural instinct to create intra-abdominal pressure. But that if I moved on the exhale and actually made noise, that there was a lot less pain and that I was able to move more smoothly. So I took an inhale breath. And when I rolled, I used the exhale breath. I took another inhale breath. And when I pushed up, I used the exhale breath. With sound. So I actually was making that sound with each of my exhales to transfer my body weight. Okay, so We had the everything on the floor. I did everything supine to begin with, and that went pretty well. And I was able to do all those things without increasing the amount of pain that was going on in my pelvis and my hip joint. And then I decided, just like babies, to come up from the ground onto all fours and see how that relationship to gravity and that load would change for me. So again, if you are in a lot of back pain, hip pain, pelvis pain, maybe you just do some stuff on the floor for a while. You don't come to all fours. I was testing the waters. Again, this was day one. So pretty impressive to be in that kind of pain and be able to sort of move into all fours and standing positions. But I really wanted to play with those. So I came onto all fours. And since that time, I've had a cancer surgery on the back of my hand that includes sutures. So this hand is not doing this activity that well. You may see me come onto my fist on this hand. And I got myself onto all fours, and it was okay. I could get here. I could get here on all fours. But what I had noticed earlier in the morning is that flexion of my hip joint and flexion of my spine were the moments where I went and grabbed my breath. So I just started to transfer the weight off of one knee and brought that leg forward. So I was doing a little bit of very slow, as though I was going to crawl one leg forward. And it transferred the weight through my back pelvis as well. And it was okay. But I did use my breath with an exhale making sound. Now, the other thing that I really want you to check in with when you're in pain is when you're in fear, when fear comes up. And fear came up for me in this next thing. I thought, oh my God, am I going to hurt myself? This was hard for me. So I took my knee and I brought it in and I flexed my spine a little bit. And at first it was very small. And then I moved into extension. And for me, the extension was about this far that day. Now I can go into a lot more today, 3 weeks later, but it was about this far. And I went into flexion and I kept it small. And I went into extension. And at this point, I was using the breath in a sort of a pattern that just felt like it was supporting. Again, the flexion was typically where I felt the pain. Once I got out here, I went into internal rotation of thigh, spine twisting, and external rotation. And I found that I couldn't keep the leg up and be in extension very much. My leg was down a little bit, but I was trying to get some rotation. So here, interestingly, is there's a lot of rotation occurring on the standing leg, this leg. But I was also twisting and turning down the right side of my body. Okay. And then I brought that knee in. Again, I checked in with my breath. Where was I holding? What was I being careful with? Was there a way to be not less careful, but less catastrophizing careful? And then I flexed and I extended. Now, this is interesting because this is the side that's affected. And as I moved into flexion and extension on this side, the left side, back sacrum, hip joint was absolutely fine. The right felt a little pinchy, particularly on the flexion. So that was when I went. And then I held the leg out. And again, I just played with finding some rotation with a real keen awareness that when I internally rotated, there was going to be a lot of stretch across this sacrum or a lot of lengthening across the sacrum of the tissues that I wasn't sure was going to be okay with me. And I'm not really trying to think of my alignment. I'm not really that worried about whether I'm arching my back or flexing my upper back. I just wanted to get some movement in this hip joint. Yep. Okay. From there, I came in. Yep. And this was hard. I walked back, I used my arms, and I brought myself into a deep squat, which for some people is not going to be accessible. It's just not accessible. it's not accessible when you're not in pain. So this is something you want to make accessible. You want to work on it really hard. It's a human movement. All humans should be able to squat. And I know that's a big word, should. It's just that we don't practice it. We can do it when we're babies and toddlers, and then we stop doing it. We sit in our cars, we sit at desks, we sit in furniture. So you can bypass this. You could also do this squat sitting on blocks. I just wanted to make sure that I was weight bearing and that my ankle, a lot of the squat has to do with ankles and dorsiflexion in the ankle, and whether your ankle has the dorsiflexion to be able to squat like this. And I wasn't that worried about being upright. I was a little forward and I just moved myself side to side. So basically, I guess what I'm saying is if squat is not something that's accessible to you, then using it as an anti-inflammatory is not going to feel all that good. So bypass this. Okay. So I already knew from my day that I needed to use my hands to help me get up simply because of the discomfort. I got to about here and I used my hands against my legs to bring me up. Okay, once I came up, I just stood for a few moments, got my bearings. I put a hand on my abdomen, a hand on my torso, and I marched in place. Today, 3 weeks later, I have a lot more stability than I did that morning. This was really hard to load weight onto that leg where the sacrum was bothering me so much, was really hard. So I did this. As the weight went into that leg, I exhaled the breath. Why am I doing this? The exhale with sound tended to let my belly go softer. Also, when you exhale, in terms of your pelvis, your pelvic floor is drawing up into the body, which can help, I think, the activity in my particular hip joint. Why did I do this marching in place really slowly? Well, I needed to be able to know that I could rely on this right leg to weight bear, to hold me up as I walked and moved through the day. And then I took that march into a really slow, so I'm getting the weight into that hip joint, into a walk. And again, I'm not thinking I've got to hold my posture perfectly, but I am thinking, can I move from my foot, my knee, my hip? And I walked backwards as well. I really stabilized and worked with my breath, because what I found was that, again, when I had to flex this hip, my tendency was to go. I made a lot of noise the first few days that this was in such pain. Okay. Now, I knew that spinal flexion coupled with hip flexion was a little painful. So I decided to play with it. And again, when you're dealing with pain, you have to decide, what are you willing to play with? What are you not willing to play with? I had this feeling that I was not going to hurt myself anymore, that whatever was happening here was a response to something else that's going on, and that I wasn't traumatizing the tissues more necessarily, that if I did traumatize them, I would know soon, but that there probably wasn't actually even an injury back here. There was response in this area to something that's going on in this hip joint, kind of long-term for me. And I had done something that week, or I hadn't done something that week, that made this area wake up and say, holy crap, let's let this human being know they are needing to do something different. So, because again, that's what my nervous system does. It's a siren. It is an alarm system. My brain is saying, hey, you got some discomfort in here. You need to pay attention. So I played with this. And again, I'm using my hands really strongly. I took an inhale breath. I exhaled. I pushed my hands down. Now you're going to see I'm a little rounded in my back. That's okay. To about my knees. And I came back up. I used the exhale breath with sound. And I let my belly be soft. And I came down. And I came back up. I did that several times. And it didn't feel so great, but it also didn't hurt, particularly with that exhale breath. Now, I know that bending over is functional. And I knew I was going to have to bend over that week and do things. Right? So I'm using my hands. This is what I'm not doing. I tried to make it smooth. So this is as far as you may go. Soft belly. You can see my belly soft. Soft belly. And then I took it into a little flexion of my spine. 3 weeks later, and I'm telling you, I'm still feeling it a little bit in my right hip joint. Something's going on in this right hip joint. I'm very aware of that. I have some fear that there's going to be a hip replacement in the future. That's where my brain goes. I did, however, just a little over a month and a half, 5 weeks ago, complete a very hard backpacking trip with absolutely no hip pain. So I have to remember that even though there's some discomfort in this pain in this hip, and that I had done something 3 weeks ago that brought on even more discomfort, that had diffused and moved into my pelvis, that I may not be creating more injury. I may not be harming the tissues by continuing to move. And in fact, for me, I'm going to come back up to standing now. And in fact, for me, what I found was beginning to move and finding ways to move and moving regularly and not sitting around a lot with this stuff going on back here really increased my capacity to, I'll use the word heal. I'm not sure this was an injury. It was a response to something, but it allowed me then to move on. And by Thursday, I was in an advanced, so that was Sunday. By Thursday, I was in a kind of an intermediate advanced yoga class with my teacher, Christina. And I was really able to do most everything. So anyway, that was my routine. I know I talked a lot throughout the whole thing, but I hope that you will find what I said helpful to understand that you're not necessarily creating more tissue damage or even tissue damage at all if you find ways to move while you're in pain. I want to say that really carefully. I am not telling you to go out and move your body and create more pain. I'm saying find ways for you that you're able to move your body and also find out what it is that you're doing habit-wise. Holding your breath, grabbing your breath, making a lot of noise, bracing to get somewhere, and see if you can find a means of letting go of that sort of trauma response a little bit. I was shocked that making that exhale breath and touching my legs with my hands, even a soft touch, somehow gave me support to be able to bend over while in pretty intense pain in this right pelvis. All in all, I hope that was helpful for you. I'm back up and running. I'm going to literally running. I'm going to go back to weight training as of today. And so we'll see how that goes. I'm going to take it nice and easy. I won't be putting a bunch of weight on my shoulders and going into squatting right off the bat. So anyway, I hope that was helpful, and you can let me know.